So a lot of people, myself included, when we first wanted to get better at talking to people, what we wanted to do first was to get the formula right. We wanted all this knowledge about conversation that we can apply when we actually get down to talking to people. Now, the problem with that is when it comes down to the actual moment, all that pretty much goes out the window. We get all this content, we get oversaturated, and we can't actually apply that practically in a lot of the times we talk to people. So this video's purpose isn't necessarily to teach you tricks, even though I will be laying out 4 things to improve how you talk to people, or to improve the flow of conversation rather. The aim of this video is to get you to come out of a conversation feeling good, right? It's not actually to have some sort of statistical measure of how your conversation went. Because to be honest, you can't really tell that. A conversation, especially one in which it's casual, is just meant to vibe. You're not meant to think in an over-analytical way. I've made this mistake myself. When I go into conversations, I try to put on this analytical thinking to it, as if there's a practical formula on how to have good vibing conversations, when actually it's just very simple. Now, some of you might be thinking, if I'm just concerned with how I come out of a conversation feeling, how do I know that I didn't just talk this person's ear off, appear narcissistic? Why should I only care about me? So the thing with that is, you can't really gauge how a person leaves the conversation when you're talking to them. You can't really tell if they came out of it feeling the same way you did. That might be a video for another day. So today I'm just going to cover how you can best position yourself to come out of a conversation feeling really good. Because ultimately the conversation will end. You can't talk forever. And so what are the things you want to generally cover in a conversation for you coming out of a conversation feeling good as the ultimate goal? So in my little communication journey where I've been talking to people, trying to get better at this, trying to improve the relationships that I have, I've gone through many iterations of conversations where it was awkward, where things just didn't quite make sense, where I felt like I came out of the conversation less confident than I was even going into it, which was already shaky and unconfident. Making mistakes that I will share with you today so that you don't repeat those mistakes, and some of the things that I learned that I wish I knew earlier in those interactions to improve the interaction coming out of it. So without further ado, here are 4 things in order to get out of a conversation feeling quite good. So number 1 is you have to start. You actually have to talk to people, hot take, in order to get better at this. There's people who I've talked to in the workplace and in my relationships. Now, they are very charismatic in the way they talk. They know when to chime in for jokes. They've got their tonality down very, very well. Now, all of that I can explain, but to actually apply them is a different story, because you physically don't know how to do that at this stage. Even I'm still working through that now. But they got to that stage because of endless repetition. They got better at doing it just consistently and every day. So a lot of the people that I work with are consultants, and they're good at talking because they're consulting. That's how they got all those repetitions in. Now, a lot of you are not consultants. If you're not exposed to conversations all the time, you're not going to get better at this no matter what tips and tricks, no matter how much YouTube videos you watch, you are not going to get better at this. Only through practice are you actually going to get better at this. So you got to start. When you walk into the kitchen, when you walk past people in the workplace, when you talk to friends, hang out with your friends more. These are ways to get started, right? You need to be comfortable with sitting in an environment where you're on one-on-one or one with many. It doesn't matter. If you get used to that kind of environment, you will become more comfortable. When you become more comfortable, your analytical, stressful, anxiety mind is going to shut off. And when it calms down and shuts off, you can start talking normally. Once you're in that kind of mood, everything flows much better. The first most important thing is to just start, to get the repetitions in, get used to that environment, and then you can finally start having like proper vibing conversations. But that alone isn't going to be enough. In order to come out of a conversation feeling much better, you need to do more than just that, which leads me to point number 2. And that is doing some talking yourself. There's heaps of content online that tells you that you should reserve how much you talk, you shouldn't talk so much, and you should let the other person do some more talking that makes you look cool, charismatic, etc. That is partially true given certain circumstances. Now, I've actually tried to apply this. The issue that I encountered is that when you're not very savvy with conversations and you don't talk, the conversation just simply dies. Now, I don't think the content that we see online is trying to tell us to not talk when it's not called for. I don't think that's the point they're trying to make. But what I want to emphasize here is that you do need to do some talking yourself, especially at the start. This is just to kickstart the engine. This is like turning the car on and just keeping it on for a bit. You need to get into a dynamic with the other person where they're tossing ideas comfortably to you and you're tossing ideas comfortably back. If a person is a stranger, or for someone you're not entirely familiar with, or they're just in a bit of a more passive mood at the time, they're not going to do that much talking. It becomes on you to do a little bit. You can just give personal input. You don't need to give like a whole life story or your emotional problems or traumas. That's not what I necessarily want to communicate. It's just that if, for example, you're in some sort of kitchen and you're talking and they go, how's your day been? Then you reply with, yeah, good. You're like, yeah, good. Well, then it's not really going to go anywhere, right? You're not going to have a conversation. What I recommend you do is actually talk a bit about what happened during your day. Or maybe not even just this day. If there's nothing to talk about this day, you can even refer to another day. How's your day been? I'm like, yeah, not too bad. A bit boring, not much. Yesterday was a bit more dynamic. I had some spicy meetings and juicy talks yesterday with some of our colleagues. Right? Then it becomes a little bit more interesting. It's not just about this day. You don't need to stay on topic. But I'm giving personal input. That person didn't ask me about the day yesterday, didn't ask me about my weekends, didn't ask me about my family or specific hobbies. You can just unsolicited give that yourself. This is the start of you throwing threads to the other person for them to catch. When they take note of some of the topics you're talking about, weekends, a certain hobby, skiing, boating, professional things, home decor, I got home decor going on here. When they get interested in that, they will give personal input themselves. That's the purpose of this. When you give personal input, you inspire them to give input themselves. Then you have a flow going. When you're in this flow and the person's excited about talking about something and you're excited about the same thing, this is when you start to feel good in a conversation. And it's a critical ingredient in coming out of a conversation feeling good. This already takes you majority of the way there. This alone. But this is not the only kind of dynamic you want to have with a person alone, because eventually it will just become, if it's just stuck at this kind of level, this level 2, then you're really just like a typical kind of acquaintance, and it's not really a very stimulating experience to have in the long term. And I mean only this kind of experience where you're just talking about the same topics that you're interested in, and that's it. That's really all you guys vibe over. In order to really come out of this conversation with a really strong impression of the other person, and the other person having a really strong impression of you and having a really fun dynamic, is point number 3, and that is to tease. So banter in Australia is very, very common. It is our way of talking. It's the way we show love. It's the way we do anything. It's the way we communicate humor. It's great. You guys in other countries, I'm going to be honest, you guys are missing out on quality humor. Now, you don't need to go straight into searing roasts. I'm not saying to bully the other person. Be very careful that don't bully the other person. That's not cool. What I'm suggesting here is to tease. When someone gives a personal input on something and then it's your time to talk, instead of just simply either replaying what they said or saying a similar experience, when it becomes just like formulaic, you add in something else, which is a tease. So what I mean by this is someone's like, oh, I love Star Wars. I watch it all the time. The Mandalorian, Baby Yoda, lightsabers, all of it is just great. I could respond with, instead of saying, oh, I really love Star Wars too. My favorite part of the Star Wars universe was the Old Republic, and then I start talking about all that, which is all well and good. Or I could respond with, oh, I know, you're a sci-fi geek. So a little bit of playful teasing. Note that the way I say it is not with a straight face, like, oh no, you're a sci-fi geek. That is full-blown judgment. Don't deliver it like that. The way I deliver it is with like lightheartedness, with a smile, almost ready to just laugh right at that moment. And some people may feel a little bit like, oh, come on, that's my hobby, man. Why you dissing that? But it's just a light-hearted tease. It's just a little bit of a negative spike in the dynamic. Now, you can actually like Star Wars and say that all the same, because I never said I didn't. This is just a playful dynamic to add spice to the conversation, adds flavor to the food of conversation, if you like. This makes it funny, and majority of the cases that I've spoken to people with a very light tease, they find it funny, right? Or at the very least, they understand your intent. You just got to make sure that your intent and your delivery is like playful, Otherwise, otherwise it will be perceived as just like a judgmental insult. Be careful not to go there. Another teasing format that's a lot safer to do is if someone mentions something like extraordinary or even something that's like a little bit out there, like, yeah, I've gone skydiving before. I could respond with, what? Nah, you're messing with me. No way, nah, you didn't. That kind of denial, that kind of tease is pretty much accusing the other person of lying and trying to show off when they probably actually did do it. And then a dynamic could happen where they're like, no, I did it. And then they start pulling out their phone and showing you something, or like, proof, validation that they actually did it. And then when you see it, you could be like, oh, true, that's crazy, man. You got bravery, man, you got balls. And that makes a person feel validated and like justified as if they won something, but actually you were just being a tease the whole time. But this gets positive emotion flowing inside of the conversation. That is the point of this teasing and playful denial. This was something that I actually learned from a coach. And when I actually applied this, it's actually insanely effective. It really helps any dynamic. When you've got a number of conversations in, you're more comfortable in conversations. You've also got this input that you give personally to make sure that there's trust going in the conversation, there's back and forth flow of topics that you're both interested in, and you sprinkle in some teasing. You're already in a very powerful position to walk out of a conversation feeling really good. But what's critical is this next point. But you can screw this up without the fourth point, which is to stifle that flow. And the most common way that I've done this is cutting people off. So number 4 is not to cut people off. When I'm in a flow, when I'm excited, when I'm teasing, when positive emotions are coming about, or even when I'm just starting a conversation, I'm a bit anxious, I start talking before the other person has finished their point. Now, a lot of you may or may not have this problem, but if you do, let me just explain what happens here. So what I've observed is that when I talk to people, and these are the same people who I've had a really good flow with, and then another time that I talk to them, I was a bit jumpy on my point number 2, giving personal input, and I would cut them off in their train of thought. This actually confuses the dynamic of the conversation. It confuses the other person in when they're supposed to talk without appearing rude to you, even though really you're being rude to them. Then they will be shyer to give their own input because they feel like they need to make a certain point in a succinct manner before you cut them off, because you are misreading when you're meant to talk. This is particularly bad because now it's very difficult for them to get into the flow. They're a bit more alert and wary of when you're going to talk. And when they got that wariness in, that fear in, it's very difficult for them to get into the flow with you. Now, if they're not in the flow, you can detect that pretty quickly. And so when it's kind of stifled in that manner, the conversation is slightly sabotaged. Now, the reason why I was doing it was because when people would talk and then maybe pause for a think, I would misread that as if it's the end of their talk. And I would then think it's my turn to talk. The reason why I think it's my turn to talk is because I would actually be really scared of prolonged moments of silence. I would think that's super awkward and I don't want to be in that kind of situation. Silences can be very awkward if they're unnecessarily long. But it's better to play it safe that when there's a moment of silence, let it sit there for about 1 or 2 seconds, maybe even longer, that you just sure that the person has stopped talking. Because sometimes the person stops talking, finishes their train of thought, they sit in the silence for a bit more, and actually they want to say a bit more on the topic. So just let it sit there for a period of time before you have your input. Now, there's also the case where someone mentions a topic and that triggers a memory in you and you want to share about an experience you had to get that flow going. But the thing is, the person is still talking to you. So hold that thought and just wait. Wait for them to continue talking and to stop. Some people like to talk more. Some people like to talk less. Now, if you want to share a bit of input and maybe this other person is slightly boring you, you can start to show symbols of like wanting to talk. Then they will finish their point. Typically, people will correctly read your signal, like that. When you show a symbol like that, which is, for those of you who are just listening, it's me holding up my hand and like opening my mouth as if I want to talk. They will catch that cue and then they will finish their point and let you speak. The key is not to interrupt the flow. unless absolutely necessary and you're like in some sort of professional meeting or something, but that's not the kind of conversation I'm talking about today. That way you can get the flow going whilst also making that second point that I made, giving personal input and having that flow going. You can safely safeguard that kind of dynamic. And I will tell you honestly, there is points when the person is talking, you remember something, you let that person keep talking, and then you forget that experience or memory that you had. That's okay. The main point of this is to ensure the flow. You don't need to tell them about every single experience that you had, that you can't anyway. Like, you have a whole life yourself. You will never fully encapsulate and talk about all of that to the other person. So those are the 4 things that I do to ensure that I come out of a conversation feeling really good. With the first point, is to start, is just to get a lot of repetitions in so that you become comfortable in conversation. The second one is to be comfortable giving your own personal input. This just ensures that the boat is still rowing. You are giving a little bit of topics to the other person so that they can jump on board and start talking themselves. The third point is to tease a little bit, get a little bit of humor in there, talk a bit of crap. This gives a very positive dynamic between you and the other person, a much more friendly, evocative kind of conversation. This is much more stimulating than your typical one. And the 4th point is to not interrupt the flow by cutting them off unintentionally. Be comfortable having a point in your mind, but not communicating that just yet. And be comfortable sitting with a few seconds of silence if necessary. And then make your point or speak. But what about you guys? Let me know in the comments what you do to come out of conversation feeling really good. What are some of the experiences you've had with interruptions or awkward silences? Let me know in the comments below. If you like that kind of content, like and subscribe, and I'll see you all in the next one.